It's an interesting position that I find myself in, being the first plenary speaker, but also having a hard act to follow in that I'm straight after Susan's pre-conference plenary last night, which I know a lot of you were at, but not all of you. For those of you who weren't, allow me to give you a summary of Susan's key takeaway point. Hunston 2017, that's the talk last night, argues convincingly for the centrality of dinosaur clip art in corpus linguistic academic discourse. I was convinced, so in the spirit of this innovation, the extinct animal mascot for this presentation would be Gigantopithecus blacki. For those of you who don't know what a Gigantopithecus is, this is a Gigantopithecus. If you're saying to yourself, by gum, that looks like an orangutan that's been caught by the wrong end of a shrink ray. Well, yes, that's exactly what it is. It's exactly that. So that's a Gigantopithecus. It went extinct about 100,000 years ago, and the spirit of Gigantopithecus will be haunting my talk, much as the dinosaurs did Susan's. Whenever you see the Gigantopithecus appear, that's a key point. Now on to the introduction that I had before I saw Susan's talk yesterday. Okay, so this, as Stefan mentioned in his very flattering introduction, I think a lot about methodology. And one of the things about methodology that seems to be at the core of the recent interest in topic modelling, as well as a whole range of other types of methods that have been used over the years, is the issue of multidimensional spaces, especially when we're dealing with word form frequency. And I will explain what I mean by multidimensional in a minute. And LDA, latent Dirichlet analysis, which is the most commonly used form of topic modelling these days, is often, as we've seen, not only from Susan yesterday, but also from assorted papers that have come out over the past few years, it's the most commonly used form of topic modelling. It's often put forward as a solution to that problem. It's used in digital humanities, and now, as we've seen, it's starting to come into linguistics as well by some pioneering efforts. So I'm going to talk about these issues, and then I'm actually going to, round about 15 minutes in, I'm going to transition into presenting a worked example of this kind of analysis that I have done. And I will work my way through this to the question of, well, what else could we do? And round up with some final thoughts, which are not, I will spoil the entire thing, my final thoughts will not be 100% favourable towards LDA. So if that's what you wanted to know, whether I like it or not, then feel free to leave. You know, that's it, that's the end. An additional disclaimer regarding the discourse pragmatics of the preposition towards in academic plenary titling contexts. Towards a critical evaluation in my title means this is not a complete critical evaluation. It's just, you know, going in that direction. So no claim that this is a complete critical analysis. Okay, so dimensions, dimensionality of data. Again, I know I've got a very broad audience here in terms of how specialised people are in maths and statistics. So for some of you this will be new, and for some of you this will be a ridiculous oversimplification. To the latter group, I apologise. But let's think of it this way. Let's say we've got a corpus of 6 texts, and we look at the frequency of a and the frequency of the in each of the 6 texts, right? Frequency of the, frequency of a. And we're interested to see if these two things correspond. I mean, intuitively you might say, probably they would. If you've got lots of noun phrases, for instance, you'll have lots of the and lots of a. If you have few noun phrases, then you'll have fewer. So we might expect them to kind of trend together. And so you could plot your frequency of a along here. You could plot your frequency of the up there. And you could put each text at a dot indicating where it is. So text 1 is here, that frequency of a, that frequency of the. Okay, so hopefully we're still at the level of, like, you know, pre-GCSE maths, so everyone's following me. And we can see that there's actually some kind of trend there. Of course there is, because I made up this data to illustrate the point, and so I could make up whatever I liked, so I made up a trend. But we can see that the two things go together. But you could ask, well, what if we think about other things that come at the start of noun phrases, like, for example, the frequency of some? Well, it's easy. You just add another dimension. So now instead of a two-way graph, We've got a freeway graph, where that represents the frequency of the, that represents the frequency of a, and then going backwards represents the frequency of some, and you've got this kind of off-angle third dimension going backwards. Yeah? Easy. But what if we want to look at this, and that, and so on and so forth? Well, we're in trouble then, because the human spatial visualization system isn't really very good at more than 3 dimensions. But theoretically, if we're measuring things, we could just keep on adding dimensions, couldn't we? As long as there are words to add, we can add more dimensions. We could have, say, a dimension for every type of determiner there is. I don't know how many there are, let's say 15, I have no idea. So then we've got a 15-dimensional space measuring the frequencies of determiners. And if you can visualize a 15-dimensional space, I guess you're in the wrong profession. The pure mathematicians are recruiting. So yeah, we can't really do the graph thing. And what if, instead of just looking at determiners, you say, I want to look at all words. I want to look at every word type in the corpus, measure its frequency, and compare that in my graph of spaces. Well, that means that you've got a dimension in your space for the frequency of every type in your corpus. So here are a few corpora that I happen to have available on CQP Web. I have a secret view that no one else has, which lists all the type counts in all the corpora, so I just got that from there. So there's a few of these here, and you can see that the very smallest number of types comes from the American English 2006 corpus, which the 2 creators there, Amanda and Paul, they're here. So 54,000 types. That means that if you use the frequency of each of those as something you want to put on one of these multi-dimensional graphs, you've got a 54,000 dimensional space. I don't think even, like string theorists have that many dimensions. I think they usually top out at about 11. So, okay, so we've got 54,000 dimensions if we have 54,000 types, but bringing in big data, because we just heard about it, well, big data actually isn't really like AME06 or BE06. Those are small data by modern standards. Big data is much more like the UK Webber's corpus, 1 billion words. That's a 50% sample. The full thing is 2 billion. But in 1 billion words, 6 million types. So we've got 6,800,000 dimensions. This gets ridiculously hard to manage. Even if you had the kind of brain that could visualize this, how the hell are you going to analyze it? How the hell are you going to pick out the correspondences that are easy to spot or not spot with 2 dimensions, maybe even 3, but beyond that, it just becomes impossible. So what we can do is we can talk about these word frequency things as vectors. And a vector simply means a sequence of numbers, each of which represents a distance on another dimension. And when you're talking about word frequencies as the dimensions, then the distance along that dimension is the frequency of the word, right? So the frequency of the word gives you basically a long set of coordinates. So let's say we count the frequency of all our word types, and then we take our normalized frequencies for that in text 1, and we get our numbers, and we go right the way down the alphabet. So A is 0.03 because it's A, it's really frequent. And then you've got abacus, alien, antelope, aardvark, so on and so forth, right the way down the alphabet. That gives us a vector which positions the text or corpus in the 50,000 dimensional space. Okay? So just like an XY coordinate, 2 numbers positions you in 2-dimensional space, these 50,000 numbers position this text in that space. And then we can have another vector for each of the texts that we're looking at. So we've got a vector, a vector, a vector. Different texts then have a vector that define them, put them in a point in space. Each number in the vector we can also call a feature frequency, and the features in this case are our word frequencies. Is everyone following along? I know this is not necessarily the easiest concept, but once you get it, it's fine. And then another thing to introduce from, I think I'm up to A-level maths here rather than GCSE maths, is the idea of a matrix. Features can be more than just words, that's something I'm going to come back to. And basically, when you put your vectors together, where you've got your type frequencies down, you've got your types down here, and then your bytext frequencies across here, you've got yourself a feature matrix, right? So each word is a feature, the texts are then the data objects, and you've got a frequency score for each one right across the way. So if you've got 50,000 words and let's say 2,000 texts, that's 100,000 or a million. I've lost count of the zeros. Anyway, a huge number of numbers. Okay. So the question is, how do we interpret this? Because we want to know something about how these different frequency features relate to one another, how they define the text in this massive conceptual space. How do we actually analyze this? Well, one of the first steps is to say, do we really want 50,000 dimensions? And the answer is, well, how many dimensions is too many? Well, I don't know exactly where you cut it off, but 50,000 is definitely too many dimensions. So the first step that you want to take with this kind of data, a feature matrix like that, is to come up with some way of saying, let's recast it into fewer dimensions, lower complexity data. And so that's what I'm calling, that's what kind of inspired the title of the talk, word form vectors, word form matrices and their frequencies. How do we deal with it? Well, as Susan was actually explaining in the pre-conference talk yesterday, there are a variety of exploratory methods that have been used over the years. And many of these are essentially purely quantitative, right? They are number crunching methods which use the tendencies in the numbers as observed to group features, which in this case means word form frequencies, to capture the trends and the variation across this whole matrix. So for instance, if we observe that the and a always get more frequent or less frequent together, as in my original graph, we can say, aha, those actually belong together. They are not two different dimensions that cross-cut at right angles. They're actually moving in parallel. So they're one dimension. So there we are, we've got down from 50,000 to 49,999. But the statistical number crunching methods do this systematically and get us down to a much simpler model by grouping things. So here are a few of these quantitative number crunching methods that we know about. Factor analysis, anyone who's read Biber 1988 or many of his others on multidimensional analysis will know about factor analysis, which reduces many variables, such as our word frequencies, to just a few factors. And the best way to think of what a factor is, it's a super variable. It's a variable that has absorbed and conquered many lesser variables. Cluster analysis is another way of doing it. This is where, instead of grouping together the dimensions, you use all the dimensions at once to calculate distances for the objects apart from one another. So how far away are the texts, taking into account all these dimensions from one another. And then based on those distances, you group them together into different clusters, and then you work out how those clusters are related by distance. And eventually you assemble a big tree of clusters of all your data objects. Our data objects in this case, remember, are our texts. And finally, those two are kind of very widely used, but then this brings us close towards topic modeling. We have assorted data mining methods where we use some kind of machine learning of a model to statistically summarize all the variables in some way. Now there is actually another one that we could stick on there, which would be linguistic analysis of the variables. What do I mean by that? Well, linguistic analysis of the features, in this case the word forms, would be to say, use what we already know about language to avoid this massive word form vector in the first place. So for instance, we know that the and a are articles. So why measure them separately to begin with? Stick them together because we know they belong together. So for instance, this is how you can use tagging or lemmatization to reduce the number of features. So rather than 50,000 word type frequencies, you've got maybe 135 post tag frequencies, or a couple of hundred semantic tag frequencies. Lemmatization is similar, although obviously for a language like English, which doesn't have very much inflection, lemmatization doesn't reduce your dimensions all that much. But basically all of these have the same idea. We've got these ways of annotating our data, which are based on sophisticated amounts of linguistic knowledge that have been built into the system by the people who created them. So we could use them to collapse our word form vector down into a more manageable vector of something else. And this keys into a point that Susan was making yesterday when she described topic modeling, I think, as a linguistically naive method. So essentially, this then would be your non-naive approach to addressing the word form frequencies, whereas the previous set, data mining, factor analysis, cluster analysis, that would all be naive because it's purely, as I said, crunching the numbers. So yes, but let's assume that we're putting aside linguistic knowledge for now, and we just want to do some number crunching. We could do some machine learning, some data mining, and it could be unsupervised. In machine learning, unsupervised has a specialized meaning. It means that there isn't a target analysis that we know is correct that we're trying to get our machine learning system to produce. Instead, we're trying to get it to produce something, and we don't necessarily know what until we get it. Topic modeling is an example of this. And this is where I have to put in one of my provisos. There's all kinds of different topic modeling things. Today, I am not going to attempt to even address any of them other than latent Dirichlet analysis, because there's just not enough time. But you may have heard of something called semantic vector space models, if you've been listening to the kinds of people who talk about these things. It's very similar in principle, but different in detail. So yes, latent Dirichlet analysis, LDA. What is it and why do we care? Well, I'm sure you've heard about topic modeling. LDA is one form of it, as I've said. Topic modeling is what I consider to be the epitome of the big data approach, because it's data mining, right? It's in we go, we just we crunch through our numbers, roll, something comes out at the end, and you know, it's great, it's machine learning, it's number crunching. And it was originally developed for computer science purposes. So for instance, looking at product reviews on sites like Amazon, if you model the topics, you can find out what each review is talking about. That's what they were doing. And it has become part of the standard machine learning toolkit. But what you see is that topic modeling, once it gets away from the people who invented it, you see it also being applied to relatively small amounts of data, and especially in humanities studies. There's a trend, and since I'm at a CL conference rather than a humanities conference, I can say this. There is a trend when humanists, historians, or literary scholars, when they get to know, I should be doing something digital. So they go across to the computer scientists and they say, I've got all these texts, what can I do? The computer scientists say, aha, use topic modeling. There you are, done, problem solved. I've seen this dynamic happen, not necessarily exactly like that, but I've seen it happen. Any computer scientists in this room are excused from that overbroad generalization simply by virtue of turning up at CL. You have proven that you're not the sort of person to do that kind of thing. However, there are lots of computer scientists out there who would. And so there's been a big move in digital humanities to look at topic modeling for relatively small amounts of text. The classic one, which you may have heard of, was published online rather than in a journal, a study of a early 19th century midwife's diary entries via topic modeling. And I've forgotten the surname of the guy who did it, unfortunately. And of course, because it wasn't published, I don't have a reference. If anyone wants to find that, then just let me know and I'll dig up the blog post for you. Anyway, so it's spread kind of through the digital humanities in this way for people looking at their historical text collections. It's also now being used in CL, as we've seen with the Murakami et al. Paper, which Susan used yesterday. And I should say at this point that if it sounds like I'm being critical, I'm not. I've read the Murakami et al. Paper. It's not out yet, but I found it on a Birmingham Research Archive server, so I read it there. And I thought this is the best topic modeling paper I have read, because all the topic modeling presentations that I've seen at digital humanities conferences over the past few years, I go, right? But unfortunately, sorry Susan, there is kind of a sting in the tail, sorry Paul, sorry everyone, but I think that even getting everything right in topic modeling, there's still some hard problems that you run up against at the end of the day. Gonna come to that. So, how does discourse and topics work in topic modeling and LDA? What is a topic? Well, Susan said this yesterday, it's not a topic in the linguistic sense. It's purely a model in the sense of a group of weightings which satisfies a stochastic model. What does that mean? Well, it means that there is a kind of generative theory of how discourse works, which I shall now explain. Topic modeling works on the following assumptions. A writer is someone who sits down and decides my text will consist of words from this bin of words, this bin of words, this bin of words, and this bin of words. And I'll take half my text from this bin of words, half my text from this bin of words, and then the other bins, not, just one or two. And so they walk over to the bin, and they pick out from the bin as many words as they need. So if they're writing a 1,000 word text, and they want 50% from this bin of words, they pick out 500 words from the bin at random. Now, all the words, you can imagine them being in a big urn written on little Scrabble tiles, right? And some of the words are duplicated, right? So some words appear in the bin, it's a huge urn, like hundreds and hundreds of times. And other words occur on only one tile, so they're less likely to be pulled out. But the writer pulls out 500 tiles, and then goes off to the other bins and pick out 100 here, 300 here, whatever, and then they take them back to the desk, dump them on the table, that's a text. That's how writing works in this view, okay? So we've got bins, our urns are our topics, and writing is done by pulling randomly from bins in the proportions that were decided on at the start, okay? That's the theory of how writing works. That's the generative theory of discourse. The way a topic model system works is, all right, given that that's how writers work, we know what the text looks like when they're finished. Based on number crunching, can we work out what words were in the bins to start with? So the topic model uses probabilistic algorithms to come up with a best guess as to what word tiles are in each of these bins that would have given rise to the text that the writer came up with. Yeah? Now the way, oh dear, I've gone past one. Yes, so it works backwards, right? The idea is we know the text, and we want to know what the bins are. The bins, I'm saying bins because I want to avoid the word topic for the moment. Now, the fact that it's working backwards is interesting. It has implications, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But that's what topic modeling is. You give it the text, you say, find out what the bins, the urns, would have to contain. The computer crunches, it says, your bins would have to contain these things. Or, here's my best guess as to what the bins contain based on the text. And that list of bins and what they have in them is your topic model. So, topic modeling has two problems. The first is, it's easy to do wrong or to misunderstand. And it's like pie charts in Microsoft Excel. As some people will know, I hate pie charts. There's almost never a good reason to use a pie chart. Unfortunately, Microsoft Excel's interface is set up so that when you reach for a chart, pie charts are right there at the top of the list, so everyone goes, oh, pie charts. Pie charts are extraordinarily easy to misunderstand or do wrong. Similarly, topic modeling. Again, I'm thinking about the Murakami et al. Paper. In that paper, when you read it, comes out soon, you'll see that they do things like checking out multiple different topic models with different numbers of topics, i.e. working on 50 bins, 60 bins, 70 bins, and see which one works best. Most topic modeling analyses don't do that. They think carefully about the stop list. A stop list is when you take out the function words. Most topic models just use the built-in stop list and say, yeah, that's fine, but the Murakami et al. Paper actually thinks carefully about it. There's all these kinds of things in that paper which most topic modeling analyses do not do. So, you can get past these by being careful, like Susan and Paul and crew were. But even if you don't do it wrong, there are two hard drawbacks, and they are randomness and transparency. Problems in the concept arise from this transparency issue, the issue in interpreting the topic modeling. And I have to thank Matthew Gillings here, who is writing a paper about this, but he let me read it in advance, because he did a big study not of the actual topic modeling, but of how the interpretation of it works. So there's all kinds of issues in what can go wrong when you're sitting there with the output in front of you and trying to interpret it. So that's one problem. Another problem is that you've got arbitrary parameters in the setup. That is, the topic modeling procedure cannot decide how many topics there should be. You have to tell it, as I said before. And it's astonishing when I look in papers, people recommend kind of standard numbers that are completely different. Like 20, for instance, is often recommended as a reasonable place to start. But then if you look at another source, it'll say, oh, well, you should use somewhere between 100 and 400 topics. As I said, the Murakami et al. Paper does ranges between, I think, is it about 50 and 200 that you did, or something around that? You looked at lots of different intervals. So, you know, there's lots of different versions on this, and you don't know. There's another parameter, which is the number of iterations. Again, most people don't tinker with that, they just accept the single. The number of iterations is how many times is the algorithm going to go round and round and round in trying to work backwards towards the original bins. And these things range a whole lot more than, say, a factor analysis. In a factor analysis, you've got to pick the number of factors you want to get out of the factor analysis. Do you want 5 or 6 or 7 or 8? But you've only got a few numbers to choose. We can see that the number of bins that you have in a topic model ranges way more than that, right? And if you look at 50 and you look at 60, which you might think, yeah, I've done well there. Well, what about 51, 52, 53, 54? If you don't look, you don't know, but you can't possibly look at that many different topic models. So it's very difficult to have a warranted value. Stop lists, as I've said, almost all topic modeling uses this. Murakami et al., as I said, is one of the few papers that I've seen that thinks hard about a stop list. I don't like stop lists, but they think hard about it. Matt's paper forthcoming shows that it really does make a big difference whether you use a stop list or not. So we've got to think again about what does a topic mean. I kind of skimmed over that. Well, when people interpret topics, they say things like, well, it's not necessarily a type of content like topic would suggest. It could also be a style. It could also be a register. In terms of the algorithm, as I said, it's just a bin of words. And I heard this from a CS researcher who I'm not going to name because I can't remember the quote verbatim, but it was at a conference. We should probably call it discourse modeling rather than topic modeling, since the groups of words it puts together are more like discourses than they are like topics. And I was just going, why? If there was a discourse analyst in this room at this moment, they would be just going bonkers and saying, no, a discourse is not words that have been allocated together by a machine learning model. So yeah, it would be a low blow, however great the temptation, to imply that when many data miners say topic or semantic, what they really mean is any algorithm that spurs me from having to understand or care what terms like topic or semantic actually mean. So I won't say that. Randomness. This working backwards procedure. Something that people don't always grasp is that it involves randomness. The first step is to randomly make a guess, rolling dice, as to what words are in each bin. Then that's evaluated, the probability weightings are adjusted, and then it's randomized again, and then again, and then again, and then again. So it's random at each iteration, but the assumption is that because you're adjusting the weightings, the randomness is going to be converging towards some kind of underlying reality. What this means is that LDA is non-deterministic, and I have to credit Derek Bridge here, who, again, 2017, that's not a paper, it was a talk. He really did underline for me how important that was. And in the room at the time, I realized that many people who were doing topic modeling, this came as a surprise. And for some of them, it was a nasty surprise. I was in a room full of historians, and they were like, oh, topic modeling, we've got to do this, it's digital humanities. And then Derek Bridge stood up and he gave this talk, because he's a topic modeling person, he gave this talk to explain how it actually works. And by the end of it, the historians were like, well, obviously we can't do topic modeling then, if it's non-deterministic, but what can we do instead? What else is there? This was the conversation that was going on in that room. What does non-deterministic mean in this concept? There's an element of randomness. Because we start with random topics, it's going to get randomized as we go along. I'm way over time already. So, Gigantopithecus says, for scholars in some disciplines, a method being non-deterministic involving randomness is an instant absolute deal breaker. Now, because we do quantitative stuff in corpus linguistics, maybe it's not such an instant deal breaker for us, but it's certainly something we should be aware of, and I'm going to illustrate it later. Now, the practical bit. Andrew does a topic model. I used mallet for this. I'm underlining this because, again, lots of the best papers, Murakami et al. Use the systems built into R, but I was thinking about the digital humanities. Almost all the digital humanists who do this sort of thing that I've seen, they use mallet. So I use mallet. It's easy to use, by the way, it's not difficult. Data. The data that I used for all of this was the J section of FLOB, as described by Hunt et al. And is Mariana here? Oh, yes. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the FLOB manual. It was such a great help in this. Anyway, so genre J, the learned genre, academic writing, but perhaps more science and humanities arts, because in the FLOB Brown scheme, humanities arts writing also turns up under bell lettre. This is 80 texts, each 2,000 words, period 1991, UK English. Why FLOB J? because it's tractable. It's a relatively small amount of data, so I could keep control of what was going on and do checks. And it's familiar. I would guess that there's probably very few people in this room who've never done anything with FLOB ever. So what I decided to do was a simple LDA analysis of FLOB using all the default settings. I wasn't going to do what Susan and crew did because, again, the point was to work through the way that the average user of topic modeling does. And then I cunningly deleted half of my slide. So what this did say was that I was doing my analysis by the standard procedure of getting the topics, looking at the top words in each topic, eyeballing them, and then trying to characterize their content. Again, if you read the Murakami et al. Paper, they go way beyond that, but standard approaches to interpretation do not. So here's my topic model. I asked for 20 topics because that's the default. It also seems reasonable. 80 topics, 20 topics seems a reasonable thing. And I said, show me the top 20 words for every topic. And this is what it gave me. Now, I don't know if you're counting in your head, but the slide doesn't actually fit all 20 words. So here it is split across 2 slides. Topics 0 to 9, topics 10 to 19. Gigantopithecus says that even with just 80 texts and just 20 topics and just 20 words per topic, and totally ignoring everything that's hiding behind this, because as we'll see there is a huge amount hiding behind this, it's still pretty difficult to get all the data into eyeballable shape to represent to an audience or indeed a readership. And again, the Murakami et al. Paper has wonderful visualizations to try and get all of this into the paper. Most topic modeling studies don't do that. Anyway, so I went down each one, I read the words, and I tried to come up with some kind of covering term for those 20 words. Again, this is what people do when they're interpreting topic models. So I came up with material physics. Oh, and I love this number 1, academic argument, made, time, work, general, mean, set, part, fact, control, common, point. And then you've got things later on which are about evidence and argument. That was really nice because it's not a topic in the normal sense, it's more one of these discoursey things. Economics. Then some which were kind of compounds, linguistics and child mortality ended up together. Transmission electronics, aircraft materials, art history, law and finance, chemistry, home, gender, sex, health, that seemed to all be together. Government environment. This was another argumentative one, amounts of data, large system form, high found range topic. Again, I didn't look at anything beyond this. Because again, that's not what is done in the digital humanities. They only look at this. You'll see that there are 3 gaps. Those were the hard ones. I didn't think that was bad. 17 easy, 3 hard. Well, let's take a look at 2 hard ones. Topic 11, those are the words. Language, knowledge, sense, theory, principle, relationships, classes, reality, meaning, play, rules, narrative, definition, class, fact, form, accept, world, game, object. I was kind of getting a sense of a bit of Wittgenstein, but also a bit of kind of formal linguistics. So I was like, is this philosophy of semantics or something like that? I don't know, that was my best attempt. Number 8, design, thalidomide, patience, aircraft, weight requirements, patience, Searle. I'm sure Searle belonged in 11, but never mind. Performance, music, GVHD, clinical, maths. And I'm like, medicine, music, aircraft design, what? I don't know. Topic 17, if you have a suggestion, I'd be delighted to hear it. I just couldn't come up with anything for that one. Linguistics, animals, discharge, animal and animals. So there's something animals going on there, but everything else doesn't fit. So, yeah, I just call that hodgepodge. Now, the idea is that you can then relate this to the text. So I thought, OK, I will pick 2 texts at random, and I did it by numbers. I took J25 and J50, not knowing in advance what they were going to be, and I did the analysis. I looked at, because the other thing you get from topic modeling is a list of the topics most strongly associated with each text. So here's J25, which is a paper from a psychology journal called The Effects of Flicker on Eye Movement Control. What did the model say were the bins that author had reached for most heavily? Well, unfortunately, you know, fate being a cruel mistress, the top and strongest topic for that was the hodgepodge. Now, let's go back. Obviously, it's about eye flicker in you know, experimental psychology. Obviously, right? Right? Okay. Then we've got education, social, psychological, that makes more sense, and then the academic argument one. Okay, those 2 make sense. And then I went for 50. And I found, unfortunately, that that also is... So rights, it's a paper on embryology, but it's law as well. And so we have the academic argument and the amounts of data evidence, that seemed like academic discourse. But then we also had the one that I struggled for and called it philosophy of semantics, and then the education one again. That seemed to me to be a bit better in terms of getting that text. Incidentally, these are the statistically strongest topics in each one. Now, often people who do topic modeling, they say, well, if it goes wrong, you should have used more topics, or you should have used less topics. So I considered maybe I didn't use enough topics. So for example, topic 3 has got some English and phonology in there, but it's also got infant mortality in there, and words like long, which I suppose could be either. You could call it a long period of infant mortality or a long vowel, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. So maybe if I'd had more topics, those two things would have been split apart. But then you've got to think, well, this is only the top 20. Every topic has a score for every word in the corpus, but you only see the top 20. Well, maybe the things below the top 20, although individually not so strongly associated, maybe cumulatively they are up to a big difference, and maybe I should have been looking at that. But again, that's not what topic modelers do, generally. Linguistics and economics seem to end up split across 2 topics, which suggests maybe I'm using too many topics. If economics is being split into 2 places and linguistics is being split into 2 places, it sounds like things that belong together are being dragged apart. So you can see there I've got economics in 2 of my topics, and I've got linguistics in 2, and then they're in the hodgepodge as well. So maybe there were actually too many topics. So I've got evidence both ways. Now, as I've said, the cumulative effect of things below the cutoff, my cutoff is the top 20 words, because that's what's sort of usually done. But what about what's below? It can add up to a lot. We don't know if the things we haven't looked at might collectively sway the analysis. By definition, we don't know what the effect would be of the things we haven't looked at. Now, this problem, I should say, is one that we as corpus linguists have kind of let slide for a long while, because people look at the top of frequency lists, they look at the top of keywords lists, they look at the top of n-gram lists, particularly in lexical bundle analysis, and the huge problem is that although everything below the top is infrequent individually, it can cumulatively add up to something as important as something at the top. So that's something that we've been kind of lax on as corpus linguists. So here's another quote from Jillings about the interpretation of that. The labelling of topics is inherently a decision made by the researcher alone. For example, depending on the individual researcher, a topic about birds could be labelled either as birds, wildlife, or animals. So if you thought my labels were shonky, maybe they were, but Matthew pointed out that this is essentially subjective. There's no agreed taxonomy. In fact, as Susan was saying yesterday, the whole point is that you don't have a taxonomy and it generates one, but then that creates problems for interpretation. It's a judgment call, as Underwood noted. Underwood did the, it was Underwood who did the midwife from the 1800s. Ultimately, it's difficult to suggest that a lower number of topics results in a broad topic range because topic labels are so subjective in the first place. So the Gigantopithecus says, there are lots of almost arbitrary parameters here. Is accepting the default good enough? Well, I just did accept the default. If you didn't think that that was good enough, then you've got your answer. Confirmation bias is a risk in interpretation. It's easy to ignore top word forms or whole topics that fail to jump out as salient. You may have noticed in my analysis that there are words in some of the topics that don't fit my headings. I was just skimming over them. Again, you'll see a lot of that in the literature. The huge number of words and weighting to report makes it easy to sweep untrackable items under the rug. That's because the topic model is not those top 20 words. The topic model is a huge number of association statistics between the words and the topics, where every word has an association strength with every topic. So here is the actual model, which I printed out in a text file. This is Notepad++, you've got line numbers down the side. So topic 0, experimental, approach, nuclear, right the way down, and when you get to line 14,000 odd, we get to jointly, which is the last term, and then we go to topic 1, and we start the lexicon again. And then we start the lexicon again, and we keep on going, By the time you get to 171,000 lines, you've got to topic 11, and finally you get to line 293,080, and you get jointly with topic 19, which is your very last, and that is the actual topic model. That's the topic model. Those top 20 words are not the topic model, they are a slice of the very top of the topic model. These 300,000 numbers are your actual topic model. Now you can see that most of the numbers are 0.01, which is the lowest possible score. It means one Scrabble tile somewhere at the bottom of the urn. But that's all there. For the 20-topic model, that's 200 odd. The overwhelming majority, 274,000 out of 293 are 0.01. But do people ever look at that? Should they? If not, are we ignoring most of the actual topic model? Now, again, model. I've criticised topic, but what about model? Usually, model means a description of a phenomenon that is simplified in some ways to help us understand how that phenomenon actually works. So, for instance, if you talk about the planets going in circles around the sun, that's a simplification because they're not really exact circles, they're ellipses. But by talking about circles going around the sun, you can start to understand things about orbits, you can start to understand things about gravity. That's a scientific model. A topic model is not like this. A topic model is a description of a phenomenon that we know works completely differently, right? We know that writers don't pull tiles out of bins. They sit there and they go through arguments or tell stories. So we know that the topic model is not what is happening. It's a model that is not aiming to tell us how to understand the process of discourse production. Rather, it's just creating computational systems that can simulate the outcome. That's not the same thing. Now, I had to get post tagging in here somewhere. As Stefan mentioned, it's almost impossible for me to talk for more than about 30 minutes without talking about part of speech tagging. In part of speech tagging, probabilistic parts of speech tagging, we use something called a Markov model, which is a model in the same sense. The Markov model of part of speech assumption basically says, well, it's a random guess based on transition probabilities and emission probabilities, which I haven't got time to explain. But basically, the Markov model is assuming that from one word to the next is kind of a random transition, producing text as we go, and it uses a similar kind of backwards working assumptions to try and work out the underlying parts of speech from the words it sees. So again, it's not totally unfamiliar to linguistics. We've been using Markov models for years. No one has ever suggested that the human brain produces text by use of a Markov model. But also, we don't look at the probabilities in the Markov model to give us insights into grammar. We know it's just a clever hack. It's not actually telling us anything about grammar in the brain. I wish I had like 5 more slides about Markov models to really make that point, but I didn't want to test your patience too much. Replication. Since I've mentioned scientific models, I should mention replicability, because scientific respectability requires that analyses should be replicable. This is where the randomness at the core of the LDA approach can come back to bite us. So I thought, well, I've done my analysis, I'll do it again. And when I say I did it again, I didn't change the data, I didn't change the settings, I literally pasted in the command onto the command line again and pressed enter, right? So bear in mind, 2 keystrokes produced what you're about to see. I repeated the topic modeling run of Mallet from that same imported corpus. And I copied the top 20 words into the top 2 analysis, and I found this time that I had 19 topics that were easily interpretable. So infant mortality plus MISC others, nations, history, classics, marine biology, theoretical linguistics, circuitry, biochemistry, blah, 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 blah. And one hodgepodge that I couldn't interpret. Thalidomide patient's boundary, so maybe medicine, but also pyrite grain sites, so anyway. I found in this case that linguistics, instead of being, kind of unsatisfactory, linguistics was dealt with great this time. We had one that was clearly about language theory, grammar and acquisition, topic 6, and we had one that was clearly about phonetics, maybe except for game and play, but otherwise very obviously about phonetics. And linguistics words weren't really popping up elsewhere. And that linguistics phonetics was one of the very few topics that appeared both when I did it the first time and when I did it the second time. Economics also was more or less consistent, marine biology was consistent, and aircraft manufacturing was consistent. What else was consistent between the first time I did it and the second time I did it? Crickets chirping. I didn't have a sound effect because I didn't know if it would work here, but I have a picture of a cricket. So the amounts of data evidence, discourse of presenting your evidence, gone. The academic argument one, all the words in it seemed to be dispersed across the other topics. It was gone. Chemistry wasn't gone, but it had transformed. Because of changes in the words inside it, it was clearly now biochemistry, whereas before it hadn't been clearly biochemistry. So there's not a lot of consistency here. And this is a slide I added. I was inspired by Susan here. She was talking about how the other words in a topic alongside a word can disambiguate it. Well, this is one that I spotted. It was the word formula. When I did my first analysis, there's where formula was. Pressure, temperature, reaction. resistance, paper, continuum. I thought it's a physics formula. Then I did it in the second analysis, formula popped up in this topic. Point, position, text, line, female, part, boot, reader, definition, points. Now this is harder, but looking at this, we seem to have maths and reading mixed together, so formula is more like a mathematical formula here. Now, maybe that's close enough for you. It wasn't close enough for me, I'm afraid. So Gigantopithecus says, even if you're on board with non-deterministic methods that can produce a different result every time, you might well find that this amount of variability may give you pause. Even if you're happy with a little bit of variability, this is a lot of variability. So if we decide we don't like it, what else can we do with these massive lists of word frequencies? Well, again, at least I can say something about Susan and Paul's work that doesn't involve what Susan talked about yesterday. The Murakami et al. Paper is one of a pair of papers, and in the other, which is due out later this year, the same approach is applied to multidimensional analysis using Biber's approach. For those of you who don't know what multidimensional analysis is, you take 150 frequency counts of features that have been designed in advance, informed by linguistic theory. That's crucial, using post tags and word sequences, post tags, post sequences, and word lists that mean something semantically. And then you do a factor analysis on them to boil down those 150 variables down into 5 or 6, and then the factors, you interpret them functionally, and you say these are the dimensions of variation. That's Biber's model in a nutshell. Now, you might say, well, what's the difference then if you've got statistics in there like factor analysis? Factor analysis is deterministic. Put in the same inputs, you will always get the same outputs. So yeah, the Huntston et al. Paper, which is in IJCL later this year, I believe, the idea was that this and the Murakami et al. Were both about the same data, but from two perspectives. Multidimensional analysis on the one hand, deterministic, linguistically informed, LDA on the other hand, much more bottom-up. But I thought, well, is there not something in between these two? You know, is it really a choice between embracing LDA with all its problems, or else doing something that is very, very theory-heavy? And I thought, must we go, if we don't want to do Biber-style multidimensional, is the only alternative to go all the way to LDA? Can we get at text-level co-occurrence patterns without those issues? And this was something that was, again, really raised by Susan's talk yesterday. I keep going on about it because I was sitting there thinking, please, Susan, don't say anything that is going to make my entire talk completely pointless tomorrow. And she didn't. Once or twice she came close, but she didn't. Anyway, and I was thinking, Susan really emphasized that topic modeling is, in a way, it's like collocation, but we're looking at not co-occurrences directly next to one another, but co-occurrence within a text. And I thought, well, if that's what you're looking at, you can still use collocation statistics if you want. They'll still work. The reason for this, Stefan, is that the basic understanding of collocation, and here's Stefan's version of it, there are other versions of it, but I like this one. You have a generalized contingency table for collocation, and it's using this notation where U is the node and V is the collocate, and you look at the co-occurrences of U and V, and not U and not V. Now, basically you say, how many times do these occur nearby, how many times do they occur not nearby? The definition of what counts as nearby for this statistical model is entirely independent of the statistics, right? In the same text could be defined as nearby, and that table will still work. All the collocation statistics will still work. We can still use the stats. All of the association measures for collocation that we use are deterministic. Same input leads to same output. I haven't done that because I was interested in something else, so that's where I'm going to finish, I think. Factor analysis, as I've said, underlies multidimensional analysis. Cluster analysis is the one that I've talked about least, but it's where I'm going to end. We've seen it being used in Stefan Gries's papers. The behavioral profiles method uses cluster analysis across feature frequencies derived from detailed analysis of a concordance. And if you haven't read those papers on behavioral profiles, do. They're very, very interesting. They've been hugely influential for me. And also, I have an app for that. I have a little thing on the web, which if you want to do some cluster analysis, it's open on the web, anyone can use it, called the uCrowd cluster tool, where you just paste in the data and you get yourself a nice little cluster analysis, and it's all terribly jolly. And I also thought, well, I want to use some linguistic knowledge. I want to propose a way of doing it. I want to use some of those linguistic knowledge tricks to reduce the dimensionality. And this is where I reach for the USAS system, Is Paul here? Ah, there you are. Give a cheer for USAS. Hooray! So I took my 80 texts, and I tagged them with clause, part of speech, and I tagged them with USAS, semantic categories. I then simplified the semantic tags slightly because the USAS semantic system is very complex, so I boiled it down to 209 semantic categories based on that semantic tagging. I then wrote a little program, the entire run of which can be seen here, to scan through the USAS output and generate semantic tag frequencies. So I have my 209 frequencies for the frequencies of the sem tags in every one of the 80 texts. So again, we're dealing with vector frequencies, but already we've reduced the problem by using the semantic tags. Basically what that's doing is providing a kind of thesaurus to group together words that are semantically similar in advance before we start the analysis. That's what it looks like when it pops out. So here are the flob texts, J1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down to 19. And here are the semantic tags, A10, A11, A12, 13, 14, 15. The A's are not terribly interesting semantic tags. The interesting ones happen between like B and S. So yes, this is a spreadsheet, and this is just the top left corner. We've got a data matrix. We can apply any of the statistical methods that can be applied to a data matrix. I could have done a factor analysis. I could have done collocation stats. I decided to do cluster analysis. And that's what popped out of my tool. All I did literally was I copied and pasted that spreadsheet into the ucrel cluster tool, pressed one button, and that was generated. It's basically a little web tool that calls R in the background to generate the image. So that's the J text clustered by semantic tags. And instantly we can see that in terms of semantics, we've got one little outlier blob here, and then two big categories. Now it's hard to read what the texts actually are, but thankfully the tool also provides a textual version of this laid on its side. It looks like this. Can you see that this is the tree, this is the top of the tree, and then it's laid sideways, and you can see what texts are close together. Now, I didn't have time to go through all 80 texts and cross-reference them to the manual to work out what was going on in terms of the bibliography. But if you read through the FlobJ manual file, you will find that similar sounding kinds of fields tend to be together in the sequence. And I find it very interesting that a lot of these units are grouping together texts with similar numbers. 52, 53, 56, 60. Here's another one. Low numbers up there, numbers in the 30s and 60s here, 22, 14 and 15 are there, 70s, 46, 76, so that's like 70s. There's clearly something going on here that is reflecting the actual kind of disciplines that we're seeing there. And there's another one, and you can see this is going right the way through this dendrogram. The dendrogram is the entire output in about 300, 400 lines of text, instead of 300,000 parameters. One in detail, just one. Again, you can see that they're all quite close together, and so I picked some common words from the titles. So this is from Mariana's manual. So you can see that it's putting together 10 and 20. Hexagons, conics, crowd droplet, depilative velocity. So there's something going on with geometry there. 17, thalidomide treatment for chronic graft versus host disease. That explains thalidomide, which kept popping up in weird places in the topic model. And that's then associated with 9 and 12, you can see there, which is proteolysis of factor chain heavy polypeptides and definition of surface exposed epitopes. This is kind of like molecular chemistry of various sorts, molecular biochemistry. We can see what's going on there in terms of these semantic tags and the distances between texts defined by that semantic tag matrix. Now, if I'd had more time, I said this was towards, I would have done things like switch it round and cluster the semantic tags rather than clustering the text to see which semantic groupings are related to one another. You can do the cluster analysis both ways. You can cluster the features as well as the objects. I would have done the same with factor analysis to see which semantic tags group together in factors, Biber style. And I would in fact probably then have tried to do, try being the operative word because I've never done it before, but I've read Biber. I would have tried to do a full multidimensional analysis there. And I'm sure that everyone in this room has already got binging in their mind other things that you could do along these lines. So how does this sort of thing stack up against LDA? This is where I really start being in the realm of opinion. Well, when we start comparing the results that we get out, we see some similarities. We see major divisions cutting across disciplines. I found in one of the branches of the dendrogram, I found hematology and mathematics together. Not quite sure why. And a similarity that I found between doing this topic modeling analysis and this clustering analysis, on the other hand, is that if you want to actually get decent interpretation, you need to be prepared to go digging in the data or metadata. There is just no way away from that. And there are arbitrary parameters. Sorry about the typos, I forgot to proofread this slide. There are arbitrary parameters. The cut is how deep in the dendrogram we decide to go, and that's arbitrary. There's no mathematics can tell you how deep in the tree you need to go. Similarly, there's no mathematics can tell you the number of topics. So there are similar issues in both these kinds of ways of reducing this massive vector, this massive matrix. But the differences are that this clustering analysis, I think, is far more transparent. The whole thing fits on one screen. The text dendrogram, few hundred lines. It's not 20 things called from the top of this massive set of parameters. It's more reproducible because it's deterministic, and we're directly interpreting text groups rather than interpreting topics. So Gigantopithecus says, obviously this is just a start, more could be done and more will be done. Some final thoughts, and this is where I wax philosophical. We've always been saying to other linguists, corpus linguistics is not just number crunching. It's essentially qualitative as well as quantitative. And I said quotes from some textbooks, including Hunston, would be good here if possible, because I wanted to give credit to Susan, but unfortunately, I forgot that I wouldn't have access to my university library while I was here in Birmingham, so sorry. And yet here is the field embracing topic modelling, which is really blind black box number crunching. So did we perhaps not mean that first thing, that CL is not just number crunching? Were we kind of like just covering ourselves all the time? If we're serious about this, we need to be especially on our guard with black box methods of statistical machine learning without any linguistic knowledge in the loop, which is the methods like topic modelling and LDA. Data mining researchers, I think, like machine learning methods because they don't require knowledge of the domain. You can have a standard toolkit. If you're a data mining person and you've got your toolkit of algorithms, you can use it anywhere, on any domain. But we're linguists. We have domain knowledge. We probably shouldn't pretend that we don't. And even without that knowledge, we already have plenty of tools in our bag for dealing with this sort of thing. Gigantopithecus says, as far as he's concerned, the concordance should still be our weapon of first and last resort, the place where quantification and interpretation meet. So not a conclusion, because there's more to do. Obviously more could be done, but I'm not a fan of LDA, and hopefully you now understand why. Too many things can go wrong in the interpretation, and we have plenty of exploratory methods in our toolkit already. Most importantly, remember what your Gigantopithecus taught you.